Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Now obviously, I should preface this by saying from the title of the video, you should know that I'm going to be speaking about suicide, and so if that is a trigger for you, then consider this your warning to switch off to something else. Watch some funny cat videos or something like that. By the way, if you ever wonder why I record so many of my videos whilst I'm out for my walk, it is partly because it's multitasking, but also since I've had my ADHD diagnosis, I've realized I actually can think a lot better whilst moving. But anyway, just to give you a bit of context before I get into it, no, I did not actually attempt it. So if that's potentially disturbing for you, as certainly it would be for most people, I did not do that. And so aside from that, there's not going to be any details of attempts or anything gory or anything like that. It's much more discussion as to what I learnt from being suicidal or having pretty severe, I guess, suicidal ideation is a term that's thrown about. But so just I wanted to preface this video with that, so you have more than enough time to switch away. And obviously, if you're a parent who's got a young person around, then this probably isn't the most suitable video for them. So having said all that, I do think it's important to discuss, because I don't think I need to tell you how bad the mental health is of pretty much every demographic at the moment. I think the biggest thing I learned, well, on the flip side, as someone who, had this happen probably, I think it's 7 years ago, I'm trying to remember. Now that I would say that I've recovered past that, although I think mental health is never a fixed thing. It goes in ebbs and flows, but God willing, it doesn't happen again. On the flip side, I want to tell you something that probably not a lot of people will like to hear, which is that nothing gets better unless you decide. And I really mean that. Like, it doesn't matter whether you are suicidal, depressed, anxious, or any of those things. Until you decide, there's three things. It must change. Number one, it must change. And it must change now. Number two, I must change it. Not someone else, not my life coach, not my therapist. I must change it. Of course, you can get help. And then three, I can change it. As in, I'm able to change it. So number one, it must change. Number two, I must change it. And number three, I can change it. Unless those three things, unless those three beliefs are in your head, nothing's going to change on an ongoing basis. And I've sort of thought this for a long time. And I saw a psychiatrist on YouTube the other day, and he's worked with anxious and depressed people a lot. It's most of his clientele. And even he says, can't change someone unless they want to change. And for a long time, I sort of fought with that, because I thought, no, if I can, get enough leverage on the client, I can get them to change. And it's not the case. And you'll know this to be true. If you've ever worked with people, you even have a friend who keeps complaining about something but never does anything about it, you'll know that unfortunately, that's unfortunately very, very true. So on the flip, that's really the biggest thing I've learned, is that whenever it comes to any situation, but I think particularly mental health, you really need to believe that you can change it, and that it's you who's going to have to change it. Of course, you can get help, but the help is not a substitute. So if you don't really think that you can change it and that it can change, you just go to see a therapist, what you end up just having is a very expensive sort of gab fest every week or once every 2 weeks. Nothing actually gets done, nothing actually changes. So that's, I think, the biggest lesson I've learned having gone through suicidality twice. I think the other thing that I learned is that it's not, a lot of people think of something, what leads to it. So I think obviously it's a valid question to ask, okay, what leads someone to be suicidal or have suicidal ideation? And I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking it's one big catastrophic thing And I guess a question of how you got there is important for people to try to figure out how to prevent it from happening again, or how to detect it in other people, which very often is difficult to impossible. And that's the biggest issue I have with suicide, is and again, these are very sensitive topics and these are just my beliefs, but if you take yourself out of the game, if you decide to suicide, you're done. So you don't suffer anymore, obviously, you're gone. But the people around you, the people who love you and care for you, there's nothing they can do about it. It's an incredible act of violence against the people who actually care for you. And no matter how you might feel in the moment, there are people around you who at the very least are going to miss you. And so, I don't need to tell you, hopefully, but at this point, that if you are feeling suicidal, that you should be calling. You should go to the doctor, go to the emergency room, call something like a lifeline or something like that. But it's this idea that, if you're suicidal, something catastrophic must have happened. Now, that is one way that you can get there, certainly. Let's say, I don't know, you made a bad business deal when you lost $100 million overnight and you've gone completely bankrupt and you can't see any way of paying it back. That might get you to the point. But I think for most people, well, I don't know if it's most, but certainly in my case, I don't know a lot of other cases, it is like death by 1,000 cuts. And what do I mean by that? I mean, for example, the first time that I became suicidal, I remember realizing it. It was a New Year's Eve. I don't remember which year, but I remember it being New Year's Eve. And I was in my apartment all by myself. And I had turned the lights off just because it just felt like, life was kind of over. What's the point, sort of thing. And again, I wasn't planning anything in particular, but just, sometimes when you're depressed, as bad as it sounds, sometimes you amplify it just because you really want to anchor at home how alone you feel. It's completely counterproductive, but this is one of the reasons why when you're depressed, the worst thing you can do is be by yourself, because your mind can take you to very dark places. But to sum it up, what had happened was I had a 6-figure coaching business, and pretty much overnight that was taken away from me, completely out of my control. Completely nothing that I had done wrong, nothing that I'd done illegally or morally, and through no fault of my own, it was gone, and there was nothing I could do about it because it wasn't my choice. There were a bunch of people who were trying to sort of go after me just to make themselves feel better, because you'll find if you're someone who's a high achiever going for success, you'll find out very quickly that achieving doesn't actually make people like you. Not a lot of people. Anyway, it actually makes you a bigger target. And so that happened. So, there goes the income, 6 figures, a 6-figure coaching business. On top of that, my girlfriend at the time decided to dump me. And I don't remember the exact reason. In fact, I even remember it, realizing at the time it's probably a good idea, because I certainly didn't feel attracted to her anymore. I certainly wasn't in love with her anymore. But still, when you've been in a partnership with someone for a couple of years and you've been living with them, and then they dump you, and then the thing is, they make it out, at least in my case, you make it out, you begin questioning what is it that you did wrong. Because obviously, if a relationship blows up, that's not the ideal situation. And so you begin questioning yourself, okay, what did I do wrong? In what way was I a bad partner? What were my failings, etc., etc. Even if, for the most part, it's a good decision for the relationship to end, and even if most of the burden probably is on the other person, you take it on yourself and you make yourself feel incredibly guilty. So it was that. My relationship imploded. Oh, and at the same time, I lost my younger sister. I think she was about 23 or 24 at the time. Very unexpectedly, very suddenly, overnight, to diabetes. Diabetes obviously is a terrible disease, but it normally doesn't take someone just overnight. And she was in hospital to have some routine sort of checkups done and routine work done, and just passed away suddenly in the middle of the night. I remember even to this day when I got the news where I was, what I was doing, and hearing my mother's voice. And it was just probably the only time in my life where I just had to sit down and couldn't function. I mean, it was a couple of minutes, but still, I'm not that sort of person who gets easily taken out of the game. And so those three things, and you go, each one of those is pretty bad, right? Having a six-figure business taken away from you through other people's vindictiveness, pettiness, and resentment. Number two, your long-term relationship of a couple of years blows up in your face. It probably wasn't even really my fault. I mean, I take responsibility for it, but really, mainly, it was through what she was doing. And then the third one, your sister, one of your siblings, just disappears overnight. And you don't get to say goodbye or anything, which I can tell, I will tell you, can do an absolute runner on you. Anyway, so when I said death by 1,000 cuts, that probably wasn't an inaccurate analogy. But what I should have said is it's multiple things stacking on top of one another. So and look, everyone has a different level of what I like to call emotional fitness. So just like physical fitness or physical resilience, if you went to do like a ninja warrior course or a triathlon or something really, really arduous, you need to train. Hopefully you train before you go and run a marathon, for example. Otherwise, what happens? You go and run, and then 10 miles in, you tear something because you don't have that level of fitness, that level of toughness, resilience to be able to do something that taxing. And in the same way, I think we have emotional fitness and emotional resilience, which is why some of us can go through really hard times and make it out just fine. And some people seem completely invincible to it. And then others, they have, they get the wrong coffee, or they get the sugar when they shouldn't have got sugar, or they get full fat when it was not full fat, when they were supposed to have, low fat, and then suddenly it's the end of the day. They just start complaining and how their whole day is ruined by getting the wrong coffee. And so for me, being someone who I think is extremely emotionally resilient in general, and this comes, I think, largely due to the fact that, I got diagnosed with ADHD last week, and now that I know that, I realize how much of an emotional toll it takes on a young person, because you're so different to everyone else and you just feel completely alone. And that's enough you don't need anything more than that to set you off, to set you down to potentially a dark place. But because of dealing with the difficulties from that, in retrospect, I think that's why I was that emotionally resilient. I will also say, in my family, it was very much encouraged to basically toughen up. And, the world ain't fair, all that sort of thing, the tough love sort of thing, which I honestly respect and think is a good idea. I don't think raising your children up to be crybabies and victims is a good idea in any way. Obviously, sympathy, love should be there as well. But being the emotionally resilient or fit person that I am, I think any one of those things would have been enough to deal with. But you stack three of those things, and then suddenly the emotional burden of what I was dealing with was more than my emotional resilience / fitness. And so there are multiple ways of getting to the point where you start thinking really dark thoughts. And it really is, when you get to that point, let's call it threshold or a dam breaking. Everyone's dam holds a different amount of water, can hold back a different force of water. And whether it's one giant wave or tsunami that suddenly overwhelms you, or it's 3 smaller ones or 10 smaller ones that eventually get to the point where it's too much for your dam to hold anymore, then the dam wall breaks, and now we're at the point of thinking or ideating about ending it all. So looking back on it now, and as I said, I've been suicidal twice. The details of the other one are actually a bit murky in my head. I can remember ideating about how I was going to do it, and I won't go into those details. And by the way, there's a difference between the ideation and the planning phase, and I say this, and this is a bit dark, but I have my hairdresser who I've written about in my book, and I shared her story in my book, so I'm not disclosing anything that she hasn't already discussed, but she actually got to the point of planning out her own funeral, who was going to be on the guest list, what music she wanted played, and to give you an idea, if she wanted Pink played, because she loved Pink, still loves Pink. But that's the difference, I think, between ideation, where it's a passing thought, and I'm not saying it's a good thing, but there's a difference between the ideation and then the actual planning of it. And if you've gotten to the planning phase, or you're at that planning phase now, please go see your GP, go see a psychologist, your psychiatrist, whatever it takes. Don't think there's anything wrong with it, just go, believe me, please. But as I said, so being suicidal twice, looking back on it now in retrospect, I would say, as emotionally, there's a counterpoint. There is a con to being emotionally resilient. I think very often when an individual is emotionally resilient, they're resilient because they're tough. But very often when things get too much, they're actually conversely quite bad at dealing with it, because their defense mechanism has been to toughen up, or harden up, or close down. So when things get too much, they haven't practiced the coping mechanisms, which I think is the thing that I really look back now and go, okay, what happened to me was horrific, and anyone would be forgiven for going down a dark road, for having those things happen to them. What I needed in that time was a way to deal with it. Not just to deal with it by toughen up, or not just deal with it by hoping that my resilience or fitness or my damn walls were going to hold, so to speak. But as those things happened, I needed a way to cope with it and to process it. I guess that's a big thing, not just hold it back, but process it. And I think there are a lot of emotionally resilient people out there who actually, their coping mechanisms are non-existent. They just kind of go around and they're so tough that most things don't bother them. But when that damn wall breaks, it's catastrophic, potentially catastrophic. And so that's something that I think, looking back now, I would have needed someone to help me with coping mechanisms. And I'm not talking about, by the way, sympathy. See, a lot of the misnomer around something like suicide, depression, or anxiety, or even recently with my ADHD diagnosis, a lot of people reach out and are very sympathetic. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. That's terrible news, etc. And I understand that comes from a good place, don't get me wrong. But I don't think that helps anything. What helps is realizing that there are people out there who legitimately care for you. Not just I love you, I care for you. No. And you'll see this in actions, not words. And I think that's the thing that really irks me about a lot of mental health. It's a lot of pretty words. It's the actions that are required. If you know someone, if you are someone who has been through severe depression, anxiety, suicidality, any mental illness, you will know that at the end of the day, probably the most curative thing there is companionship. Not being alone. I'm not talking about intimate relationship or anything like that. I'm just talking about someone being there no matter what. You don't have to talk to them. They're not gonna, say, oh, get better. Have you gone for your walk? Have you done this? They're just going to be there, hold your hand through the good times and the bad times as you work on your recovery. I don't think there's a shortage of mental health techniques at work in order to help process or to build resilience. I think honestly a lot of it is just time. Time does heal all wounds. But the danger with severe mental health illnesses is that, yes, you need time to heal, but are you going to be giving that time to yourself? Because sometimes when things get really bad, you feel that the time is skewed against you. Do you know what I mean? In such a way, it's like you're almost against a ticking clock. Like, yes, you need to heal, but you need to heal within 7 days, 14 days, 28 days, or things are just going to get too bad. And that's when people can make really, really bad decisions that are very, very final. And again, this is, reaching out to support networks and things like that. It is super important, because just that idea that you're not alone, That's probably the biggest thing that people need, whether it's depression, anxiety, suicidality, ADHD, anything else. It is that feeling that you're alone, or that you're broken, or that you're wrong. And these are things that cannot be fixed by a hashtag on Instagram or an influencer, some celebrity, saying some, cute phrase like it's okay not to be okay. Look, I understand where that phrase comes from, but I did test it. Because yes, I get it's okay not to be okay. The problem is those sorts of stratagems, if you will, tend to leave you in a place of just being okay. And no one just wants to be okay in life. If you've ever been to that place where you're just okay and you're feeling bored, that can actually lead to a very, very bad, dark place. I don't think we want to feel okay. I think we'd rather be striving towards our dream, towards having a purpose, towards achieving what we feel that we want and achieving our full potential. I think we'd rather be doing that and having a bad day, but knowing that we have a purpose, than just going through each day going, yeah, I feel okay, it's okay, it's fine. I think that can actually be very, very counterproductive. Now, I understand, don't get me wrong, I've been there twice. The first step when you're in a crisis, a mental health crisis, is obviously to get you to the point where you're okay. And so I understand the whole phrase, it's okay not to be okay, but I just wish there was a conversation past that. And I think this is where I'm trying to add some value. What I really should have learnt was coping mechanisms that were designed for someone like me. And as I said, someone who's emotionally quite fit and resilient. And I think I got there by basically closing off. I've always been quite a stoic person, not to say anhedonic, but, and I saw this analogy, I can't remember where, but I think it actually might have been the same psychiatrist who was saying that nothing changes unless you want to change. And he was saying that he just had kids. And he said that when you have kids, you can either completely detach yourself from them if you don't want to be hurt, or if you're going to truly love them, you actually also have to, at the very same time, open yourself up to the possibility of being hurt, disappointed, betrayed, overwhelmed, all that stuff, right? And it's because I don't think you can just let the positive emotions in and not let the negative ones in. Like, I think it's a tap. And when you open the tap, it doesn't matter whether it's hot water or cold water. I mean, in this analogy, there's not hot water and cold water taps. But I think that's the thing. I think you're either open to emotion or you're not. And people who are very open to emotion, you'll see they're very open to feeling, hugely joyous and happy and excited. At the same time, they're open to massive waves of, I think, disappointment or rejection or sometimes overreacting, frankly. And then on the other hand, you have people more like me who are more stoic. These are the people that you probably go to in a crisis because, they'll keep a level head on themselves. And so they won't overreact, certainly to crisis. But at the same time, it can be hard for them to, I think, sometimes really find joy in small things. Everyone can find joy, but sometimes it feels, and this crosses over between being a high achiever or type A, I think, is sometimes you feel like you need to be the best in the world or do something life-changing, world-changing before you give yourself permission to feel excited or good about yourself. So as much as I firmly believe what I learned, number one was that you need to decide you're going to get through this. Without you being on board with that, nothing else is going to work. And number two, that there are many different ways of getting to that point where you might be thinking of ending it all. But really, as I said, that analogy of emotional fitness or having that dam, and there are different ways to get to the point where that dam is going to break. And it could be one big thing, it could be several small things. But I think it's really important, this is the third piece that I've been talking about, is to have a discussion more on coping mechanisms or building emotional fitness and resilience, but in a healthy way. It's almost like, I think for a lot of people, the only way to get emotionally fit, again, if I equate it to physical fitness, it's someone who works out at the gym all the time or trains super, super hard, and so they are really fit. but they spend no time in recovery. They spend no time in active recovery or stretching or mobility. And so for all intents and purposes, they look great, they perform great, up until the point where it doesn't, and then they just snap in half and suddenly they're laid up and can't move for several months, or the career is over if it's a professional athlete. And so I think we need the emotional equivalent of that, the emotional equivalent of stretching or mobility work or something like yoga or Pilates or something for the mind, where it allows us to recover from emotional stresses or emotional traumas. So much like if you go to the gym and you lift really heavy weights, you're basically going there to traumatize your muscles. You are tearing muscle fibers, and that's why you're sore the next day. And you are proactively doing that to your body, because then your body will recover and become stronger. I think emotions are exactly the same. That's why I think the people I've interviewed who are the deepest thinkers, and for me the best and most interesting interviews, there always seem to be people who've lived through tough experiences. And I think in exactly the same way you go to the gym and you sort of tear those muscle fibers and then you get stronger, I think the analogy is exactly the same with emotions. You go through a really tough time and then you recover, you become stronger. But I think also what we need, like I said with the physical side of things, is a chance for our emotional selves to heal or to take a break, or frankly, to take a cheat day. Now, in terms of what coping mechanisms actually work, I don't know anything about therapy. I'm going down the ADHD route now, so I do have a doctor/therapist, but extremely early days, so I can't speak to that. I will say, if you want to look at mental health and very scientific proven ways of things that you can do to build that emotional resilience, there's a lot of information coming out about that now. I would certainly recommend that you look at Andrew Huberman's podcast, for example, and that's basically why I'm out here now walking around, is to get morning sunlight, getting sunlight on you and into your retinas, not by staring at the sun, but just getting out in the daylight, first thing in the morning, can really help set the platform for a good day. And if you go for not a run, just a walk, a 15-minute walk, whatever, a 5-minute walk, just get out and about, go for a bit of walk, stretch your legs, get some air in your lungs, before you sit down the whole day at your computer. That immediately sets the platform, the baseline for a better day. And there's all sorts of research now showing how effective, peer-reviewed scientific research showing the efficacy of exercise. I think the biggest one is exercise. The fitter you are, and I'm not talking about muscle size, I'm just talking about the more active you are, the stronger and better your emotional fitness and resilience are going to be. And then specifically, there are studies into things like blue spaces and green spaces. So blue spaces being near the ocean or near the water, green spaces obviously near trees, near the bush, whatever it is, and just showing how objectively, scientifically valuable those environments can be to building mental health. And so for me, this has all been really, really cool and important, because now there are scientifically validated ways of helping someone who's struggling with mental health, rather than just kind of the tired old phrase of, let's talk about it, journal about it. And look, if those work for you, I'm not dismissing them. But for me, I have found they don't work. Very often when you talk to someone, unless they are trained in this area or they're a very good listener, they kind of pass judgment on you, or they want to know why. And it's like, you go to them and you imagine, and you might have had this experience yourself, you go to someone and say, I'm really, really depressed. And rather than listening to you, they immediately want to know why. And then they begin challenging your reasons. It's like, I'm depressed because, let's say, my girlfriend broke up with me. And rather than hearing that and empathizing with it, they're like, but she wasn't good for you anyway. And so then you're then put in a position where you have to defend your reasons for why you're feeling depressed, or you're basically trying to legitimize how you feel, and that's validate how you feel, and that's really not a good place to be. That makes it worse. And so if you have the fortune of speaking to someone who can listen and listen well, which is very rare, or you're someone who finds journaling works for you, I find it just brings up more of the emotions and makes it worse. So I know a lot of people who have the opposite and swear by journaling, but my point is, you've got to find what works. And the other point is, I would advise you to do this proactively, because when the dam is about to break, when that tide starts rising, when the emotional burdens become more than your emotional resilience can withstand, you're going to need those coping mechanisms. And it's like anything else, the more you practice them, the better they get. Like the first time you go for a run, you're probably not going to be great. So the first time you do meditation, you're not going to be great. The first time you actually try opening up about your feelings, you're not going to be great. And so my advice to you, if my story has moved you or impacted you at all, and I will say a lot of people are surprised that I've been suicidal twice, because they look at me from the outside, they go, you're so put together. You can't, like, it's not like you can't, but they're actually very taken aback by it. Even my family were taken aback by it when they found out. And so that's the thing. If you're listening and you're watching through this so far, you're probably someone who's a real tough cookie. You're a high achiever, and so many people look up to you. And the worst thing you could do is tell someone that you're depressed or anxious or suicidal, because that would be like an admission that you're not quite as perfect as other people expect you to be. And look, it's an unfair burden. I get it. It's kind of self-inflicted, like when you do achieve so much that people expect more from you, and so then you feel the weight of expectation, so you achieve even more, and then people expect even more from you. But I mean, that's you, and I love you for that, because that's me as well. But it's also you who's at highest risk for that. That's what I need you to get. The people who are, prone to just playing the victim, they wouldn't watch a video like this, because they're not interested in hearing things like, well, you have to decide to take responsibility for it yourself. They don't want that. They just want everyone to feel sorry for them all the time, because that's how they get attention. And frankly, going on the road to recovery, you get less attention for that. But you're not that person if you're listening to this. So I want you, find some coping strategies for yourself. I'm going to say that the biggest one, scientifically backed once again, is exercise, getting outdoors, getting sunlight, not sitting down so much. I'd advise getting a standing desk if you can do that, and just set a timer. I recently got a Pomodoro timer, which basically I think is 25 minutes of work with a 5-minute break. The timer doesn't, it's irrelevant, like how long each section is, but just set a timer so that at least, let's say once every hour, you take a small break to just, if you've been sitting down particularly, get up, go for a walk, hydrate, get out in the sun if you can. Just get in the habit of doing that, because what that really is, it's a recovery. If you want to think about it, so it's helping you process any stresses you might have, any traumas you might have, even if you're unaware of them. And it's taking the pressure off that emotional dam so that it's not going to break next time something bad happens. Now, if you've gotten this far and you want to discuss these sorts of issues or concepts further, I put a link, if I've remembered, ADHD, so I may have forgotten, but I put a link where you can book in a coaching session with me. It's not free. I'm not in a position where I can offer that service for free yet, but that option is available to you. Obviously, I'm going to say, if you are suicidal at this point in time right now, go see a doctor, go phone a crisis line. I'm still here, my messages are still open, but I'm not a trained psychotherapist, and I'm not right next to you. So if you need that crisis support, go get that. I am not and never will be a replacement for crisis support. But I do want what's best for you, especially, again, as I said, if you made it this far, you're probably somewhat like me. So I wish you nothing but the best. I hope this was eye-opening. I'm not going to say useful, but if you've ever been down a similar path to myself, I get you, I understand you. And as I said, from my experience, it's often the highest achievers who are most at risk for things like that, because we don't put our SHIT on other people. We like to take care of it ourselves, and sometimes life gets too tough for anyone to handle by themselves. So take care of yourselves, and I'll speak to you again soon.